I just want to take a minute to introduce myself and our speakers today. My name is Carly Devlin, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm a shareholder at Clark Schaefer Consulting, and I lead the firm's IT risk and cybersecurity practice. Our speakers today, Ross Patz and Serge Kikonda, are part of our IT risk and cybersecurity team, and they help our clients with a wide variety of IT risk, IT audit, and information security initiatives, and that includes CMMC. Ross is a director on our team, and he oversees many of our engagements by providing leadership, guidance, and expertise. And simultaneously, he's a grant-funded researcher and PhD of cyber defense student at Dakota State University. Serge is a CMMC Registered Practitioner Advanced, which is a CMMC certification that he's obtained through the CMMC Cyber Accreditation Board. The firm itself is a registered provider organization, which qualifies us to provide CMMC consulting services to our clients. So with that, we will jump into today's agenda. So this is actually the second webinar in our CMMC series, and we're really excited to share some more information regarding CMMC, as well as a lot of different updates on where the rule currently stands. Along with those important updates, we'll touch on determining the scope of CMMC compliance and how organizations can go about that. We'll talk about the important role policies and procedures play in adequately complying. We'll also discuss how to identify your organization's controls related to the CMMC requirements. Also, we will talk about establishing the team of internal stakeholders and external partners that will help you along your CMMC journey. We will talk about conducting a gap analysis of your current state against the requirements. And then finally, we'll get into some next steps in preparing for remediation. Of course, at the end, like Carrie mentioned, we will have time for Q&A. So please make sure to submit your questions using the Q&A function. So before we jump in, I'd just like to provide a brief overview for those who didn't attend our first webinar. During that session, we provided a high-level overview of what CMMC is, who's subject to it, and the different aspects that are important to reach compliance. And so if you're curious about any of that, that webinar is available on demand for you to watch on our website if you missed it, and we will have a link to our website at the end if you need that information. We also talked about readiness, remediation, and maintenance as the three important steps in preparing for CMMC compliance that you see there on the slide. And so today's webinar is going to drill deeper into that first step, which is readiness. And so everything we're going to talk about today, everything that I went over on the agenda, are components of this readiness step. And before we get started, we would like to ask our first poll question.
Thanks, Carly. So before we really get into the meat of the presentation, we want to know which topic you are most interested in learning about today. Is it the overall CMMC updates, the scope, determination, policies and procedures, control identification, alliance building, preparation of remediation, or all of the above? So we'll give that just a minute. While that's tabulating, I wanted to mention, so Carly had mentioned the webinar that we held a couple of months back. I will go ahead and put that in the Q&A so that we can make sure everybody has a nice link to that. There's also a link in the resources section of your webinar control panel, and that links out to the CMMC information on our website, which will also have a link to the previous webinar, but I will go ahead and get that into the chat. All right, just another moment here to tabulate some of the responses. All right, and Carly, here is the overview of kind of what the responses are. It looks like between policies and procedures and control identification, that's about 50% of your audience is really interested in particular those two items. And awesome. Then 40% says all of the above. So I'd say,
yeah, which is great.
Yep, topics are right on track here. Okay.
Yeah, great. And so, and it did look like there were some that were most interested in the updates, and that's what we're actually going to start with today. So the proposed rule for CMMC was released in December. and the comment period is open until February 26th. So now is the time to ensure that you understand the proposed rule and submit thoughtful comments regarding any clarification needed. Serge, can you start by giving our audience some of the major updates that are outlined in the proposed rule?
Serge, you might be muted. Carly, are you able to hear Serge? No, okay.
No, I cannot hear him.
I'll troubleshoot Serge here in just a moment. We'll maybe see if Ross can step in for just a moment.
Yep, sorry, I had to turn myself off mute too. Yeah, and so if we're looking at the updates since our last discussion on CMMC, basically we were in a period of not knowing when proposed rule was going to drop, other than soon. So we got a nice Christmas present, as Serge likes to call it, and that we did get the proposed rule. So 32 CFR outlines the basis for CMMC, the CMMC program. Yep. Hey.
Okay. Awesome. There. Oh, you gotta love technology. Oh my goodness. Okay. Perfect. Sorry about that. So I simply meant to say, just to piggyback off of what Ross says or said, over the Christmas break, the DoD decided to give us the best Christmas present ever by releasing the 32 CFR, or Code of Federal Regulation, for CMMC. Now, some of you may remember from our previous webinar, and some of you may just be looking for this information, but last time we weren't really sure about what was going to happen. We weren't sure if they were going to release the interim rule. We didn't know if they were going to release the proposed rule. We didn't know the timeline. We didn't really know much about CMMC. Well, with this publication now we do. Everything has been made very, very clear. And just so everybody on the call here is aware, there are two separate CMMC rules that need to be published before the whole program as a whole is up and running. So there's the 32 CFR, which is what was released over Christmas again. And that just focuses on outlining the CMMC program as a whole. It will define the specific and the general requirement for each CMMC level. So we're going from 1 all the way up to 3. What assessment requirements and assessment types look like for each contract and subcontracts. And it'll also give you a general idea of where you land as far as timeline is concerned. Now, the second rule that was released, or that is expected to be released here in the next few months, which I'll talk about in the next slide, is the 48 CFR. Now, that one is focused on just outlining and explaining how CMMC is going to be applied to your individual contracts and subcontracts, regardless of the tier that you fall under in the Defense Industrial Base, or DIB. Now, the proposed rule that was released in December, it's about 234 pages long. It's publicly available. This is just a screenshot of it. There's about 9 supporting documents. So it's not just the 234 pages that you have to read. There are additional documents that you may want to also look into as you're diving into it. There's 49 tables on this document, some of which are really, really important for you to look at. For example, there's cost, which Ross will talk about. There's also how many companies are expected to be assessed or audited, and in what time frame and in what phases. So again, highly recommend that you go read it. Highly recommend that you take it into consideration. Now, this can be a webinar in of itself. And so today what we're trying to do, especially with the updates, is just give you the key points. So moving over here into the next slide, you might be asking yourself, when is CMMC effective? When is it actually going to start appearing into my contracts or into my supply chain? Now, CMMC officially becomes effective when 32 CFR is published as a final rule. In terms of timeline, where are we at right now? We're in the 60-day public comment period, which, as Carly mentioned previously, and I'll reiterate again, ends in February 26th, and specifically on February 26th. Right after that's done, the DoD is going to go ahead and start going over each and every comment that was submitted. So if your company wants to submit concerns about the public ruling, or about the proposed rule, sorry, if they want to submit questions, if you have comments, if you have, again, maybe restrictions, whatever the case might be, highly encourage you and your organization to go ahead and submit those public comments. They cannot release the final rule until all the comments have been adjudicated. So please, 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 between now and February 26th, you still have about a month. Go ahead and submit those comments. Highly recommended. Now, after the public comment period is finished in February, between the end of Q1 and the beginning of Q2 of this year, the 48 CFR, again, which is the rule that will explain specifically how CMMC is going to hit your contracts, is going to be released as a proposed rule, similar to what we have currently with 32 CFR. You're going to have another 60-day period, if you're not happy with how CMMC is going to pop up on your contract when they release that rule, to go ahead and submit your public comments and whatnot. Sometime between Q2 and Q3 of 25, 48 CFR is going to be released as a final rule, similar to 32 CFR. And at that point in time, that's when we're going to begin that 3-year phase rollout that I spoke about in the previous webinar. Don't worry so much about memorizing each and every date that I just mentioned or time frame. We're going to have a nice little graph that you can take a look at that will pretty much put all of this into perspective. So just take everything that I'm saying right now with a little bit of a little grain of salt. All right, awesome. Now, the proposed rule that was released, if you read through it and as you go through it, you will understand that the DoD is outlining 4 phases for that 3-year phased rollout, if you will. Each phase is going to come with its own set of requirements. So for example, if we look at what phase 1 is going to look like, phase 1 is going to begin exactly pretty much immediately after 48 CFR is published as a final rule, which, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is give or take between Q2 and Q3 of next year. Now, once that shows up, you're going to have companies that are required to be at level 1 or level 2 to conduct their self-assessment and submit that as a condition of award for your contract. So if you want to bid on a new contract, if you want to submit a proposal, all those things, you're going to have to submit your self-assessment first before you are awarded the contract. Now, when you look at phase 2, it's going to begin exactly 6 months after the start of phase 1. Now, at that point in time, you're going to have all the companies that have CUI that will be required to receive a level 2 certified assessment. So this is where C3PAOs come into play, and they're actually going to have to go on site and conduct an audit of your organization. And at that point, similar to phase 1, until or unless you have that completed, you cannot be awarded a contract. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, that timeline is getting tighter and tighter, but that's when phase 2 is expected to begin. Now, phase 3 is expected to begin about 12 months after the start of phase 2. So if in terms of timeline, in terms of what you're looking at here, Q1 of 25, so around 2025, CMMC the final rule is going to be made public. So phase 3 is expected to begin sometime around 2027. So towards the final year of that 3-year phase rollout. Now, at this point in time, you're going to start to see more and more and more, if not all of it, to be honest, level 2 certified requirements pop up on every single contract. So almost every company that has CUI or every company that has any sort of DoD classified data will be required to either receive an assessment or conduct their self-assessment before they get awarded a contract. You're also going to start to see level 3 assessment requirements pop up on contract. Now, for those of you who are wondering, yes, you may be required to comply with level 3. Now, if you are required to comply with level 3, one of the prerequisites that they outlined in the proposed rule is you're going to have to receive a level 2 certified assessment before that can be awarded to you. So that's something to keep in mind as you move through this process. And then finally, another 12 months after that, phase 4 is going to begin. Now, at this point, CMMC requirement is going to be on every single contract, no exceptions. And so, again, that will complete that 3-year phase rollout. So you're looking more like 2028. Do we know exactly when each contract is going to be updated? No. Do we know exactly when each subcontract is going to be updated? No. However, the DoD took that into consideration when they released this proposed rule. And these are two things that I want you to remember as you move through this. The first thing, and again, this was taken straight from the proposed rule, they state here that government program managers will have discretion to include CMMC requirement or exclude them and rely upon existing DFAR 7012 requirements in accordance with DoD policy. Now, I'm not going to read through the rest of the statement here, but if you read through the proposed rule, you're going to see the word discretion mentioned 9 times. And that's because the DoD and Uncle Sam, to be honest, they really want to maintain control over what happens with CMMC. They don't want to just release all the control and all the power to C3PAOs who are going to be responsible for audits. Now, what this is specifically stating is once CMMC is published as a final rule, as we get into that phased rollout, the DoD can decide to come in at their discretion and audit your company as part of CMMC or as part of your DFAR 7012 requirement, because 99, if not 100% of companies that work with the DIB in any way, shape, or form have agreed that they comply with DFAR 7012 requirements. So that's something to keep in mind in that transition period, in that phase rollout. You may want to make sure that you are in compliance with the DFAR 7012 requirement. Now, the last thing I really want you to take away from the proposed rule that was published is this statement. And again, this is coming straight from the rule, not from us. These are just pure facts. OSA stands for Organization Seeking Assessments. You can replace that with your organization's name. In this example, I'm going to use Clark Schaefer. So Clark Schaefer may elect to complete a self-assessment or pursue a certification assessment at any time after the issuance of the rule. Now, the rule that they're talking about here is the final 32 CFR for CMMC, the program as a whole, in an effort to distinguish ourselves as competitive. Essentially, what this is saying is, hey, do you want to be in good graces with us? Do you want to earn more contracts? Once CMMC rolls out, you may want to be ahead of the game. You may want to seek your compliance before everybody else, before your competitors. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Ross, who's really going to give you an idea of what that timeline looks like and what it could take for your organization to go from where you are to where you need to be. So without further ado, Ross.
Yeah, and so if we put some of the things that we've talked about, right, kind of on that timeline, so we can see where we are right now, right, the Q1 2024, we're in that public comment period. And as Serge talked about, there's going to be an adjudication process for those different questions. And so the government's going to have to go through and answer every single thing that's basically submitted. And so how long that's going to take is kind of up to how many questions are submitted. You can see there too, the 48 CFR, the proposed rule, and then where it goes final. So again, maybe come in the next couple of weeks. But you can see that we're already projecting out, Q3 2025 before that actually goes final. Now, what's interesting, or what should be kind of in the back of everybody's mind, is if we overlay on top of that, right, what they're saying for organizations, small organizations, to be compliant is organizations 50 to 500, so that's small organizations. They think it's going to take about 10 to 18 months to actually become compliant. So that overlay's fine, right? If we're overlaying it right now inside of Q1 2024. Now, again, it's January 24th right now. And so if we just move that, if we say, hey, we're just going to wait to start implementing some of this stuff, the problem is, where are we going to shift it to? And so if we shift it just Q2, right, 2024, you can see we're all the way up against probably that deadline for 48 CFR to become final. And so for this all to be in place. So, again, we can shift around maybe those 10 to 18 months, but there already exists a really good possibility that we're up against that deadline, right? We're up against the time where it's going to become final right now. So when thinking about, when should some of this stuff get started, that 10 to 18 month time frame right now is pretty critical. With anything, right, the question is always, how much does it cost, right? What is this going to cost me? What is this going to cost my organization? And so so this information does come directly from the feds on how much, right, they think each one of these items is going to cost. Now, when I first looked at it, my first question was, okay, I see, level 3 certification only says the total's, 12 grand. Well, I probably want to be level 3 then, because that's a whole lot cheaper than, $104,000. Why wouldn't I want to be level 3 then at that point? So a couple things when looking at these figures is they basically roll down. And so, reading it from right to left, if you will, is we basically be adding up those totals. Couple things also to keep in mind is on a lot of the things, right, the government's putting out right now related to CMMC, they're already expecting that, you're compliant with whatever regulations you've already agreed to, whatever you've signed off on. So if you have said, hey, DFARS, yeah, we're good with this, let me sign the document, they're already expecting that in a lot of these costs and a lot of these time estimates that you're already there. So if you're not, if maybe you don't have some of those controls in place, or don't have them effectively in place, that's going to add to the cost and add to that timeline. The other thing I think it's really important to look at is, at the end of the day, any new product or any new thing that an organization's doing, right, it's a business decision, cost benefit, right? And so if you're looking at certain levels and saying, well, really the work is, only generates a couple $1,000s in profit or $10,000 in profit, but I'm going to have to be, level 3, then that is a question. That's a question you should be asking right now, because this is, getting really close to that decision point, go or no go, of should we, continue to do business that we know we're going to have CMMC certification for. So now is the time to ask that question, be really honest, is this something we want to do? Because we know there's going to be costs, internal costs and, actually paying out money.
Yeah, thanks, Ross, and thanks, Serge, for providing the audience with these really important updates about the proposed rule. And, now that there's a little bit more clarity on the CMMC timeline, I know the hope for us is that organizations will begin to take a more aggressive approach to preparing for compliance now that we have some of the answers to the questions that we've had now for a couple years. So with that, we want to ask our audience the second poll question.
Yeah, so our second poll question is, do you feel that your organization is on track to reach compliance according to the timeline laid out in the proposed rule? Yes, we feel like we're ready to comply. No, we haven't even begun preparing, or C is maybe, but we'll likely need significant help. And this is just a chance for us to kind of see, from the audience where everyone stands on track to reach compliance according to the timeline laid out. Again, if you're interested in CPE for this event, you definitely want to participate in the poll questions as well as the other requirements that were set out at the beginning of the webinar. Don't forget, if you have any questions during today's event, feel free to use the Q&A widget on your control panel. All right, we'll give it just a second here to tabulate, and then we will put up the results of our polls here. All right, Carly. So good news is everybody's at least preparing a little bit.
Yeah, no, that is good news. Obviously, the least amount of people said no, they haven't begun preparing at all. So love to see that, but it sounds like there are some, a good chunk that feel like maybe, but they'll need some significant help. And so, that's what we're going to focus on now. What should that preparation look like? What does this readiness step actually look like from a tactical perspective? And so, Serge, can you walk our audience through the key components that they should be thinking about when it comes to readiness, starting with kind of that first step of identifying the organization's scope for CMMC?
Yeah, absolutely. So just going back to what Carly said again, the first step in readiness is identifying your scope. The bigger your scope, the more your assessment is going to require. The smaller your scope, the smaller your assessment is going to be. So let's take a look at two separate scenarios for that. Okay, and what I want to show you exactly with these two specific scenarios is how you can go about setting up guidelines, policies, procedures, and whatnot in order to limit the scope of your audit. There's something called a CUI island, or you can simply refer to it as like your Pandora's box for anything CUI. And so we're going to look at what that looks like in these two scenarios. So the first one, let's assume this is your company. So you have all these different devices, laptops, cell phones, include your CNC machines or whatever else you use to produce CUI parts for the DoD, add all of this to this little mini environment that we've created. Now let's pretend like all these devices have CUI on them, right? And they're all interconnected in some way, shape, or form. What does that mean in terms of the scope of your audit? That means all of it, every single one of them is within the scope of the audit. So I've had this asked to me before in previous interactions with various clients. What does that mean for my company if maybe I work from home and I have remote access into, our systems and I can download some things and maybe print them at home. Those documents are CUI and whatnot. By the law of the land today, your home would be within the scope of the audit. Now, is an auditor actually going to go to your home and verify how you protect CUI? Probably not. But what they will do is almost definitely fail your company on the spot. So you want to make sure that you limit where CUI is stored, who has access to it. Again, this doesn't just involve technology, it also involves people and other resources, your contractors and whatnot. You want to make sure that, again, CUI is limited, which is where we're going to dive into this second scenario of what it could potentially look like to limit the scope of your potential audit. So if you have two separate environments, again, on one side you have CUI, and on the other side you don't. Maybe on the other side you have your intellectual property, your commercial products, those sort of things. And you do not want those involved in as part of your CMMC audit. And you find a way to properly delineate the two environments. Some companies obviously have more resources than others. So some companies might say, hey, this building is government work only, and this one is not. Or maybe this part of the what is it called? The OT space is CUI/government work only. The other side is not. Regardless of how you choose to approach it, as long as there's that delineation, only that section, again, that island, that Pandora's box, is going to be within the scope of your audit and nothing else. Same goes for the people who work on these things. Now, again, what that looks like, if I was an auditor coming in, this is the only thing that I can take a look at. This is the only thing that I can audit, what's circled in red, and nothing else. So what you want to do even today, you want to go within your organization and start having discussions and trying to identify where your CUI is located. Not just your CUI, but include your FCI as part of it, the actual contracts that you received as part of your agreement in order to make those parts or whatever. So you want to start identifying where that data is, where that information is, who has access to it, and maybe start to, again, create guidelines around what should happen with that information so that it's not just scattered everywhere. Now, after defining your scope, which was step one, moving into step two, identifying or creating policies and procedures. Now, what's the difference between the two? It's important to, again, understand that policies and procedures, first and foremost, that they work together, one, to increase your compliance, two, to make sure that people understand and have a consistent understanding of your organization's processes, structures, guidelines, that sort of thing. Everyone needs to understand the roadmap for what's required of your organization as far as compliance is concerned, obviously, but also for day-to-day operation. You don't want one set of your employees to do one thing and then the other set of your employees to do something completely different. You want to make sure that you change that culture so that everybody's on the same page. And that, to be honest, is where the bulk of the work is going to come in. You can install technology in the blink of an eye, but to change people's mind, that is where you're going to have most of the work. So you want to make sure that you look at comprehensive policies and procedures to implement so that, again, your operation is consistent, controlled, and it encourages and enforces compliance. Now, in terms of differences, the easiest way I love to explain policies versus procedures, a policy is the what. What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want your people to do? As you can read here, it's a predetermined course of action. The procedure itself is the how. How are you going to actually go about making sure that people take or actually behave the way that you want them to? And so if we're to look at a couple of examples, this one specifically referring to access control, the policy would look something like this. Again, you can replace company name with your organization's name. And in this example, like I said before, I'm going to use Clark Schaefer. So Clark Schaefer will provide all users with limited access to our assets, to our resources, in order to carry out their assigned roles or their assigned duties and responsibilities. And that's the only thing that we'll do. We'll limit your access so that you can only do what you're supposed to do. Now, that might be the policy, again, the what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to limit people's access. The procedure, the how we're going to go about doing it, simply could be before you receive, for example, privileged access into an account, that you request written access from an IT administrator, from your manager, from somebody, right? You go about explaining to people how they can obtain that privileged access, but you establish those, again, specific course of action that they need to take in order to comply with your policy. So this is just, again, a very generic example of what this looks like, but your organization needs to go about creating both policies and procedures in order to enhance compliance. So step one was, again, defining the scope, identifying how big your the scope of your audit is. Step two was identifying the policies and procedures, or at least creating them. Now, step three is going to go about identifying the controls that you need to comply with and determining whether you comply with them or not. Now, again, as I mentioned in the CMMC updates, as part of the proposed rule, they released 9 supporting documents, including this one, the CMMC assessment guide. There's one for level 1, there's one for level 2. I believe that they're still in the process of developing the one for level 3. However, NIST 800-172 has already been published, so you should use that as your guide in order to, prepare yourself for potential level 3 audits. But go ahead and take a look at, again, the most current and up-to-date version of the CMMC assessment guide. What we're going to do today is, again, walk through a very basic example of what that would look like if you were trying to identify the controls that you do comply with and the ones that maybe you don't. So looking here at control 3.1.8, which says limit unsuccessful logon attempts into your system. Now, even as part of DFAR 7012, or DFAR 7012, yes. So even as part of that, you are required to comply with 800-171. Now, what most people don't understand is just because 800-171 has 110 controls that you need to comply with, it doesn't mean that, hey, once you look at a control, you put a checkbox next to it, yes, I comply with it. That means that, yes, you're going to pass your audit. The truth of the matter is, as you can see in this screenshot or this picture or this figure here, that in order to comply with CMMC, you're going to have to comply with NIST 800-171A requirements or assessment objectives. In other words, yes, there's 110 requirements, but there are 320 assessment objectives that they're going to be auditing you on. They're not going to be auditing you based on the 110 requirements. They're going to be auditing you based on the 320 assessment objectives. And yes, we're also aware that there's 800-171 revision 3 that's currently being developed. That should be released at some point around the March timeframe. So something else to keep in mind. Now, what does this look like in terms of compliance? So there's 2 assessment objectives for this particular control. The first one means the means of limiting unsuccessful login attempts has been defined. Again, this is where your policies or your procedures come into play. In this example, maybe your organization goes about limiting unsuccessful login attempt to 3 consecutive ones. And if there's 3 consecutive failed attempts to log into the system, maybe the account gets disabled for 30 minutes. And another procedure you might add on there is you need to reach out to the IT help desk in order to regain access into your account, however your organization decides to go about it. But that's one way to address this assessment objective. Now, the second part of it is the defined means of actually limiting that unsuccessful login attempt to your system is implemented. It's one thing to say that you're going to do it, the what, it's another thing to actually go about doing it. So as you can see in this screenshot right here, this is an Active Directory screenshot. So it shows that the control is actually implemented. And that's what your organization needs to do. It needs to not only define how you're going to go about limiting access, how you're going to go about carrying out certain tasks and whatnot, how you're going to go about complying with CMMC requirements, but you also need to have the means, the ways that you're actually going to do it implemented for you to pass compliance. And you can prove that compliance with screenshots. Maybe you do a live demonstration when you're being audited, whatever the case might be. So it's not just going about it by just writing a whole bunch of policies. Make sure you implement the actual control itself. So here are some key questions for you right now. Do you have a system security plan, which is part of your DFAR 7012 requirements? Do you know the controls that you currently have in place? Have they been documented? That's a big thing for CMMC, documentation. Do your controls operate effectively, or do you need to go back and tweak them consistently? Are you reviewing your controls? Are you testing your controls? Who's helping you with your controls? And the list can go on and on and on. But again, the big idea here is, what are your processes that you've put in place right now to make sure that you are ready for CMMC?
Thank you, Serge. And I think you've provided some critical information on specific steps that organizations should be taking as they're kind of in this readiness phase, preparing to comply. And so with that, we'd like to ask our next poll question.
Yeah, so do you feel comfortable with the resources and level of expertise you have internally to start preparing for CMMC? A, yes. B, somewhat, but we'll need some guidance. And C, no. Do you feel comfortable with the resources and level of expertise you have internally to start preparing for CMMC? So again, if you do have any questions for our presenters, feel free to put those in the Q&A widget. Also, if you're interested in CPE, make sure you complete this survey. We will have one more. So if you missed one during the prior questions, you just hang on till the end and we will do one final poll question for everyone in case you missed one. All right, now we will go to the results of this one. So Carly, I'll let you kind of check out the results there and see what you think.
Yeah, good. I think over half feel like, yes, they do have the resources internally to start preparing for this. So that's great. It looks like then the next highest percentage is somewhat, but we'll need some guidance. And then there's some no's. So yeah, I mean, this kind of just shows every organization is different in terms of the expertise they have in-house to be able to, perform this readiness. Some have internal teams with the knowledge and skills to adequately prepare, but others don't have that expertise at all, really. And then others, maybe they do have the expertise in-house, but they want an independent check of that work to make sure that they're truly going to be ready for an audit. And along with that, the other component is that a lot of organizations are relying on third parties to actually support their information security environment. So it's important for organizations to understand, who are the key stakeholders internally and externally to successfully achieve CMMC compliance. And so, Ross, can you talk about the important aspects of, alliance building and identifying that team to help you with compliance?
Yeah, and like you just said, Carly, it could be, when we're talking about alliance building, and we're going to primarily focus on those external parties. But this really could be, a lot of these could be the same internally too that we're going to cover. And when we're saying alliance, it could be all external, it could be all internal, and it's probably going to be a mix of both kind of in the end. So as far as identifying your team, so when you're thinking about, who I need to make sure maybe knows that we're going to have to be compliant with CMMC. So your third-party vendors, so if you outsource, if you have a security operations center that you outsource to, if you have a managed service provider that helps you with your technology, or a managed security service provider that maybe, monitors your antivirus, or even other organizations, like Serge mentioned before, your contracts. And so, do you have outsourced accounting that has, access to some of your contracts? Okay, then it's possible that they might get roped into this too. So, really when you're thinking about it, you need to look at that scope. It all comes back to scope. It always does. But you need to look at that scope and say, who's actually touching this? Now, getting back to my comment about it could be internally too, identifying again the different groups in your organization. Maybe, you say, hey, we have 99% of this, in-house, but making sure those other groups outside of, just you, who is maybe overseeing CMMC compliance, but outside of just you, that they're aware that this is, going to be something that is going to happen, right? That you're going to have to comply with. Now, again, for these groups, it's important that you start having conversations with them now. If they are, outside organizations, that, it shouldn't be 6 months from now or a year from now when you're finally springing on them, hey, by the way, we're going to have to be compliant with CMMC, and you're along with us for the ride type of thing. So if we look at kind of those things to remember, depending on the different organizations or the different groups, all the organizations can only do so much. And so if you are outsourcing some of those functions of the organizations, it's important to remember, again, you can't transfer all the risk or transfer all the compliance or controls in your environment to those other organizations. That again, at the end of the day, that you're going to be responsible for your actual environment. You're also responsible for holding them accountable. So, that kind of gets to the third point there, that, their failures may become your failures. So if, you're relying on them for a really important control inside your environment and, that control fails, it also then fails for you. Some of the different requirements too, they might be, required to take on certain parts or maybe all of CMMC at a certain level because they're actually, providing services to you. And I apologize about the beep. I lost power for about 30 seconds. So, yay. But so I think, again, it's important to remember, it just doesn't affect your organization. It's affecting, who's inside that scope and who's providing those services. Again, important things to remember too, even if you're just saying, hey, we do all this internally, again, roll out a program and then point to IT and say, hey, by the way, you were supposed to implement this. So then we get to RPOs. So Clark Schaefer Hackett is a RPO. So again, kind of a reminder of what RPOs can do or, how they fit into this. RPOs are kind of unique in that we say they can do as little or as much as you need, and that they can actually help you, become compliant with this. We mentioned it before, but mentioned it here on this slide also, that pre-assessment part, and really anything leading up until that assessment maybe, and even during the assessment. So, maybe you are, in the area where, hey, we think we're good. Would really like to, have a pre-assessment done though. That's something an RPO can do. Maybe you're an organization and, you feel like, hey, we really don't have anything at this point. Again, an RPO can come in and help you establish the controls, make sure that you're actually aligning with CMMC. And then again, kind of that last part for the actual assessments, maybe there is something that comes up during assessment. Maybe it comes up during a self-assessment, and you've identified that. Again, anything like that, again, RPO can help you in that case with the actual assessment, maybe remediate that or come up with maybe a way that it really should have been addressed like this, or maybe that's an incorrect answer that you were given. This is actually the case. So anywhere kind of along the journey of CMMC for an organization, RPOs can help. So as far as identifying your team, some of those key questions are, Are the people you're working with fully aware of their roles and responsibilities? Again, that could be internal or it could be external. Again, it's going to depend on how we're kind of defining that scope and also your organization. Clear written agreements and expectations, it goes back to, if we are outsourcing, maybe some of those key controls, or maybe we're outsourcing some of the functionalities of our organization. Again, do those organizations know that we have to be, in compliance with CMMC? And then, are there penalties, right, if something should happen? Or, the next one, how are we actually checking up that they're doing what they say they should be doing? So getting, vendor management into this. And again, that last one about, penalties. If something does go wrong, what are the responsibilities, right? Are we just going to drop them away? Are we going to help them remediate it? Those are all questions that you should be asking, again, as you're identifying that team aspect of how is this all going to work? So we've defined the scope, right? We've said this is kind of our team that we're going to go forward with. We've identified any outside organizations that are going to help us or that are, core to our business functions. And then we're going to conduct a gap analysis. So again, when we're identifying gaps, there's some things that are unique, right, to when we're documenting them for different things for the government, like CMMC. But really, gap analysis, we're trying to identify weaknesses, right, in our security controls, and then we're documenting them as part of a plan and action and milestone. So a POAM, you'll hear it referred to as a lot. We'll cover the POAM here in a minute. And this is really the opportunity to strengthen or harden, the environment through, the improvements. With a lot of things the government does, it's not necessarily that you have a gap, right, or you have a deficiency, but it's that you're doing something about it, that you have identified it, and you're working to address it. And that's where the POAM comes in. So with the POAM, what is it? The POAM is the document that's basically going to outline, right, here are the different gaps in our organization, or here are the different gaps against a standard or framework that we've identified, and this is how we're going to address them. It should outline the different steps that you're going to take to actually remediate that. So again, it's not enough to just put on there, hey, like in Serge's example, that, we don't maybe have a way to limit access attempts. What are you doing about it? What does that timeline look like? And so if we go back to that example that we looked at before, and we say, okay, maybe if we're looking at it, that top part, right, we have good policy and procedure around it, right? But then if we look at the bottom part, actually implementing the technical control, we don't have that, right? So we have a policy and procedure of what we should be doing, but we're not actually executing on it. That would be something that, should be going in your POAM. It's also important to remember at this point too, that, with this, it's also important to remember at this point too, how you're actually going to evidence some of this stuff. You should be taking that into account. So, Serge talked about it before, documentation is really important. But on some of these controls, do we have a good way to evidence it, right? If I'm providing as evidence this document, is that acceptable? Is this in a good way? There's various examples of controls where, okay, this is what we have, but we have no way of evidencing it. In audit, we always say, if you can't evidence it, right, if you can't show me, prove to me that it's actually occurring, the control doesn't exist. And it's going to be the same way for CMMC. So if we're looking at the POAM, we can see the first part, we're saying, hey, that requirement, right, that A part, we meet it, right, we're fully met. And then on that second one, we haven't met it yet. Now, this is just a small kind of portion of what a POAM usually looks like. Usually, like off to the right-hand side, you'll have different things on it, like a timeline, right? And so we'll say it's currently January 24th. We've identified this as an issue. We don't have the technical means to actually implement this part. And so, by quarter two, maybe we're going to implement it, right? And here's exactly what we're going to do. Because what you're trying to show, with a POAM is that your program's actually grown, that you've identified, again, those gaps or those vulnerabilities inside the organization, and you're actively working to try to address them. Again, that's what really the POAM is showing. Yes, it's documenting gaps or vulnerabilities inside the organization, but again, it's really to show the growth of the program, and that you're not just saying, hey, we're good, right? That you are continuously trying to make the program better. So again, key questions for identifying the gaps. You should be at this point, if you've done that pre-assessment, right? Or even just started to look at CMMC, you should have started identifying, some of those different gaps as part of your POAM. And then as part of that POAM, right, how are they actually being documented, right? Are we documenting everything we should be? Are the control owners identified? Okay, we've documented all the different gaps and the different controls in our environment. One, do we even know who to go to, right? This is a gap. Who's going to fix it? Who's responsible for fixing it? If we're trying to collect evidence, who's the actual person or organization that we're going to go to and say, hey, can you provide this screenshot or this piece of evidence from this server? Gap remediation action steps taken or steps identified. So again, what does that process look like, right? It's not enough just to say, hey, we have this gap. What are the steps you're taking to actually address them? And when have you actually taken those steps? And that remediation plan timeline been established. Again, that should be part of that POAM document. Again, showing the lifespan, right, that remediation effort that you're doing. So preparation for remediation. So what we're basically looking at is, right, the next step or our next webinar and what we're going to cover. But so we've gone through readiness, right? That's what we've been talking about, gone through the readiness process, and we're trying to look ahead to what does that look like. So we've kind of outlined, those steps. So in getting from step one to step two, some of the questions maybe that you should be asking, or questions that we'd be asking you, is have you, completed step one fully? Have you completed that readiness assessment? Have you then said either, yeah, we're 100%, or we think we're 100%, right? We have everything we need, no gaps, our evidence is good, we're solid. Okay, if not, have you identified it all for all those different things? Have you actually identified control owners? Do the control owners know that they're control owners? Is another good point. Do they understand the control, or is the first time somebody's going to talk to them about the first time they've ever heard of any of this? Identifying the remediation. So again, all those resources, funding, new tools, additional staff are things that we're probably putting in a POAM, to again address and show that progression of how we're actually doing the remediation. Have you determined when the remediation is actually going to occur? Is it logical, right? That's probably the other thing to call out about some of these timelines around POAMs is I can identify, that, hey, we have this huge gap in our program, and we say we're going to take 10 years to address it. That's not really timely. Nobody's really going to buy that type thing. And so, making an honest, guess about this is the timeline we think we're going to hit. And if we don't, we're probably going back to that timeline. We're not changing it, but then we're updating it and saying, hey, this is what caused this issue, right? This is what caused us to be off the mark on this. Prioritization. So again, are we, taking care of some of the small stuff first? Maybe some of the bigger gaps in our program, we're developing out more, right? And then are you aware of the potential impact on business operations? So again, like Serge was saying, before, if we're trying to kind of carve out, different parts of our business, and so we know definitely this is where CUI lives, that's going to be probably disruptive. It's not going to go smoothly, and it's probably, cutting off resources that people are expecting to be available. And so, again, making sure that everybody's aware that this is going to impact the business in this way, or maybe some of that transporting back and forth of data isn't going to be able to occur because of it anymore. So again, kind of those 8 questions, you should be asking, or again, we'd be asking if you said, hey, are we ready kind of to move on to that step 2?
Awesome. Thank you, Ross. And so moving on here, we wanted to finish up today with sharing some resources for you to utilize after today's webinar if you're looking for more information or if you'd like to reach out to our team. So you'll see on the slide here that there's a link to a tool that will help you understand how CMMC may apply to your organization if you're just kind of in the beginning stages. There's also a link to our CMMC page on our website, and that includes our first webinar on demand. And I think, as Carrie mentioned, she also included that within the chat, and then also our contact information. We also wanted to point out that we will continue this webinar series to provide updates and then also walk through the process for complying. So as Ross mentioned, kind of the next step in the process after talking about readiness or pre-assessment is that remediation phase. And so we're planning to do our next webinar focused on that